Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to Talk with Sue. I'm glad you could listen in tonight. Tonight's show will continue on with the For the Record series, and that's dedicated, of course, to examining and understanding the concerns of critics to the current proposed Muskrat Falls deal. Tonight, our special guest is former Premier Roger Grimes, who also held many cabinet posts, as we remember, including Mines and Energy. And, of course, let me see now, the one other thing, I think he was actually my boss for 2 years. That must have been a real pleasure. But we're going to ask him to join us now and go over several topic areas that I think would be important, considering his background. And it's special, I suppose, to be a premier. There's not very many people who ever achieve that. And as a premier, of course, you go through various protocols, and your job type and description is very different than most of ours. So tonight we're going to go over Mr. Grimes' initial concerns, his comparison with the Voisey's Bay deal and this proposed deal, the sanctioning process for the Muskrat Falls deal, talk a little bit about Hydro-Quebec or other potentials, other partnerships, other proposed deals in the past, and whether or not he believes there's another way to go. So let me welcome to the show former Premier Roger Grimes. Hi, Roger.
Hi, Sue.
I hope that wasn't too bad, except for the boss part.
Yeah, I don't think there's anybody that could be a boss of you, as they say.
Well, let's get right into it. We've all been listening to the Muskrat Falls discussion now for a good while. And there's obviously a lot of concerns out there by numerous people, some of them with energy backgrounds, others with legal backgrounds, others with regulatory backgrounds, and, of course, people who have been in politics on all sides of the House. You are the former premier. What are your initial concerns about this project?
Well, let me say this, Sue, from the beginning, so that no one gets confused. I am pro-development of the Lower Churchill and the energy resource that's there. It's been attempted ever since the days of Frank Moores as Premier, I guess, right on through with Brian Peckford and Clyde Wells and Brian Tobin and myself, and now this particular attempt. And I believe at some point in time that we should develop the potential of the Lower Churchill. Now, notice I didn't say Muskrat Falls, because the Lower Churchill has possibilities for energy development both at Gull Island and at Muskrat Falls. Gull Island being 3 times as big, by the way, in round numbers, about 2,400 megawatts as opposed to roughly 800 for Muskrat Falls, and a great potential to provide relatively green energy long into the future. And again, the reason that premiers before me and myself as a premier spent time, energy, and effort trying to develop the project because there should be a benefit in it for Newfoundlanders and Labradorians long into the future that outweighs the concerns of the environmentalists who'd like to see it left as the Grand River and to reap those benefits. Just the fact that you can benefit from other than the fact that the Upper Churchill's already there, but the rest of the Churchill River Basin can be used, for its environmental friendliness and for hunting and fishing and just enjoying the environment. But I'm not in that camp. I really believe that it's a resource that should be developed. The alarm bells went off for me, Sue, when I heard this announcement. I was hoping it was going to be a good announcement. The first alarm bell was that we were going to do Muskrat Falls, which is the much smaller development, rather than Gull Island, because every bit of discussion that had been held up to that point in history had focused on Gull Island, and my understanding of it is that even in the first few years of Premier Williams' time in office, that he was focusing on Gull Island as well. And, of course, there's a good logical reason for that. In the attempt that we made, a very serious attempt that we made when I was the Premier, that had started before that with Brian Tobin and also with Clyde Wells, was to develop Gull Island, the 22, 23, 2,400 megawatts, and to basically use it as an export-based project where the sale of the energy to an outside market would pay for the cost of the project, and Newfoundland and Labrador would benefit from being able to recall the amounts of energy that we would need for our own uses, primarily in Labrador, which is the issue being talked about now about potential mining developments and so on, that we would recall that, but that the export sale of the energy to an external market through Quebec into the eastern United States or Ontario or wherever would generate enough cash to pay for the cost of developing the project. And that was in the project that we were just about to do before we ran out of time in my term as office. That project was, I would describe it as marginally profitable. You could sell all of the energy for the full life of the project under a power purchase agreement and raise enough cash on an annual basis to pay for any and all loans that you would have taken out to build the project in the first place. So the project would pay for itself, and it wouldn't cost ratepayers or taxpayers in Newfoundland and Labrador a single cent. So then if we needed some of the energy for use in Labrador, then you'd do a cost-benefit analysis that if you called back some of the energy and didn't sell it for a profit, if you sold it for less than that in Labrador, then a cost-benefit analysis would have to justify that the jobs created in a mining venture, the taxes that would be generated for the province, the royalties that would accrue to the province by having a new mine developed, that all of those additional benefits would more than offset any loss that you would take on the sale of the power to an export market. So Gull Island, which was 22, 23, 2,400 megawatts, was marginally profitable. And when we had looked at Muskrat Falls with only 800, there was no set of criteria that could ever show that trying to sell 800 megawatts into the marketplace, even if you had a power purchase agreement, could generate enough cash to pay for the project itself. So as soon as I heard that it was going to be Muskrat Falls instead of Gull Island, the alarm bells went off, and I started looking at the information. The information, Sue, showed this. The dam and the powerhouse, which generates the electricity itself, at Gull Island and Muskrat Falls are not much different in size, not much different in configuration. The Gull Island one was going to generate 3 times as much energy, 3 times as much electricity, but it wasn't going to be 3 times as big. It wasn't going to be 3 times the cost. So there were some cost efficiencies in doing the larger project that just didn't and still don't present themselves in the smaller project. So the dam and the powerhouse were, relatively the same cost. But the energy production at Muskrat Falls was only going to be 1/3 of what it would be at Gull Island, and it just didn't make any economic sense to try to carry the burden for the financing on 1/3 of the potential revenue that you could get from Gull Island. So Gull Island itself made sense. Gull Island probably makes sense today, even under this scenario, but Muskrat Falls just doesn't seem to do so. It's not profitable itself, and I wondered, well, how come they're doing it if it can't pay for itself? It's certainly not going to pay for itself through the export of power, because the only power that we know for sure, the only energy we know for sure that's going to leave the province if the whole project gets done is the energy that's going to Emera for 35 years, and that energy is going to return to the province in each of those years 0 cents, because they're going to put up an upfront investment into the power line, which they'll own, by the way, the transmission line. They'll own it. They're also going to own part of the transmission lines on the island, which is a brand new concept that we would ever let anybody else own some transmission territory and equipment and lines on the island itself. You know, we're proud owners of our own natural resource, and now we're going to bring a partner in and let them own part of the transmission on the island itself, as well as totally own the transmission across the Gulf to Nova Scotia for 35 years. So the energy that we're going to transmit for 35 years over that line generates a total revenue of 0 cents. Absolute zero towards what's happening. So again, that raised another question. Well, where is the money coming from? And then it finally struck me as to what's really wrong with this arrangement, in my view, is that the arrangement that Nalcor, being the big boss company, is going to make and has put in place and will put in place with Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro, which is the hydroelectricity company that we've known for years, since its inception now 50, 60 years ago. The arrangement is that no matter what happens, Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro, as a subsidiary of Nalcor, is going to be forced to pay for all of the energy that's produced at Muskrat Falls. 100% of it. Even though we know that 20% of it for sure is going to Nova Scotia for free for 35 years, but Hydro has to buy it from Nalcor. And even though now they're talking about there might be some mining ventures in Labrador which might need some of the energy, I'll come back to that a bit later because I've got some problems with that as well. But no matter what happens, the mining interests will be paying less than the cost of producing the energy at Muskrat Falls, because they won't be viable without a lower cost than that. So the only people going to pay for it through Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro, which you own and I own and we the people of the province own, are the ratepayers and the taxpayers on the island, because there's going to be no change in the rates in Labrador, by the way. Labrador, the one good long-term benefit that came to Labrador West, Churchill Falls, and Happy Valley Goose Bay, it hasn't extended to the coast of Labrador yet, but the one lasting benefit that did come to those parts of Labrador from the Upper Churchill is that at least they have and enjoy the lowest electricity rates in North America, because they're tapped into the resource at the Upper Churchill, which is the lowest cost per unit producing energy in North America today, to my knowledge and to my information. So there is a benefit. But what's going to happen here is that the ratepayers on the island, not in Labrador, their rates aren't going to change. And as a matter of fact, the mining companies and others will be looking for lower rates and subsidized rates and so on. But the ratepayers on the island are going to pay a constantly increasing price for the whole 50 to 55 years of the agreement. And that's the deal that Nalcor has set up, so that they are held clear and free. By using the routine of the Public Utilities Board, they will be guaranteed to get their total investment back, plus an 8 or 9% rate of return. I mean, anybody else in Newfoundland and Labrador now investing money anywhere would love to think that they could get all their money back plus a profit of 8 or 9%. I mean, the banks today are paying interest rates of 1%. Other groups are lucky to get interest rates of 1.5% and 2% and 3% with some risky ventures. This group is going to be guaranteed a rate of return of some 8% or higher. And, of course, Nalcor is going around saying, well, we're going to be profitable. Of course they're going to be profitable if they can take whatever the cost of the project is and offload it to the ratepayers of the island. And the cover-up for that, as I see it, it's not a nice phrase, but the cover for it and the cover-up for it is to say, well, listen, rates were going to go up anyway because the cost of oil was driving up our electricity bills. At Holyrood, the rates were going up. The overall rates were going up. And that's going to go on for the next 50 years for sure, guaranteed. And that's what they put into their estimates. They got it from this group that give them their estimates now. The problem with that is that since 2010, the estimates they've been using have already been too high 2 years in a row. They estimated this year that it would have gone up a couple or 3%. They estimate that last year it would have gone up. And a matter of fact, from when they started in 2010, oil prices have leveled off and actually gone down a little bit. And there are groups out there now, including the one that advised the government back then, that are suggesting that oil rates are going to stabilize over the next short to long term, and that they'll be nowhere close to what they were predicting was going to happen to the price of oil and therefore the price of electricity coming out of Holyrood. So the more you look at it, the more angles you look at, the harder it gets to understand how this is ever going to be profitable. On a standalone business venture, Sue, it cannot possibly be profitable, only through the mechanism of having the ratepayers on the island pay the increases no matter what the cost of the project is. So if the cost of the project is $6.2 billion, which they estimated at the beginning, then our light bills will go up a certain amount every year for 55 years. But if the cost of the project happens to go up to $8 billion, then Nalcor is still going to be profitable for one reason. They're going to dictate through the PUB that our electricity rates are going to go up more than they thought. No matter what happens, they're going to cover all their costs, no matter what the costs are, and they're going to be covered by ratepayers on the island, all in the guise that the rates were going to go up anyway. Oil prices are scary, and you can't trust them. But then again, the one thing about them, they go up and they go down. That's what's happened in history. There are cycles. The same thing happens. People realize it with the weekly fiasco, I'll call it now, even though I brought it in, fuel price regulation at the gas pumps, tied one way or another to the price of oil. And one week it goes up 10 cents, and guess what they're predicting tomorrow? Going to go back down 9 cents. But what they're saying about Muskrat Falls is that you can never, ever expect that the price would ever go down. It will go up forever for the whole life of the project, even after 2041, when we get access to the Upper Churchill energy, when we should have a boon and a real profit on our hands. Well, even past that for another 15 years or so, our rates are going to still be going up to pay for Muskrat Falls. So, Sue, I'll stop there for a minute because I'd like to, go on and talk a little more in detail about the more recent things about mining prospects in Labrador and what's happening there and a few other things. But that's where the alarm bells initially went off for me, is that Muskrat Falls, as the smaller of the two projects on the Lower Churchill, can never on a standalone basis be a profitable business adventure. And the only way Nalcor has found, with the compliance of the government, to cover their own backs and make sure they don't lose any money, is to foist whatever the costs are onto the ratepayers on the island, not in Labrador. They'll still enjoy low energy and low electricity rates, low energy cost, low electricity rates. But on the island, the people on the island that use electricity in any way, shape, or form, turn on the light, turn on the television, use your deep freeze, heat your home, your rates will go up every year, guaranteed, for the full life of this project, no matter what happens to oil prices, no matter if whole new mechanisms are found in the world to produce electricity cheaper. It won't be cheaper here because it's going to take 50 to 55 years of steadily increasing prices to pay for this project.
I want to just segue you probably into a demand issue, but just going over a couple of points because, as an energy advocate for, over 20 years now, I'm hearing some of your points. I'm listening to what's being said, and a couple of things have struck me strange as well. Let's deal with the Emera side, and wanted to get your take on this. I'll just go through the 4 points quickly, and then perhaps you can give your take. When power is generated and developed, and you have a customer, the customer usually pays for generation, transmission, and distribution. That's what we all pay as ratepayers when we pay our bill. We pay for the cost of developing and generating the power, the cost of transmitting the power, and the cost of distribution of the power. In the exercise with Emera, they're paying for a transmission line. I do not see the payment for the generation and distribution. That's one. The second is, you mentioned Danny Williams, former Premier Danny Williams, and his initial desire to go the Gull Island route, as all premiers have done before him, versus Muskrat Falls. And what I remember distinctly is that at the time the discussions were going on with Hydro-Quebec and the development of the Lower Churchill, at no time did I hear that we were in an energy crunch and a crisis. And we went from, we're going to stop talking to Quebec, so therefore we'll look at Muskrat, and by the way, we have an energy crisis. And this was at a time also when industries in the province were actually shutting down. The population hasn't grown, and presumably efficiencies in basic household items like appliances and light and heat and, the type of insulation you have and that sort of thing, all those efficiencies are naturally built in with technology. So all of a sudden we've gone to that. Then the third is this whole concept of, we should have to pay this much, and here's how much it's going to cost, and it's all going to the ratepayers of the province. Anybody that wishes to study what is probably the best one to study, which is Hydro-Quebec and the one that's bantered around the most, when they have done significant developments in the past, the idea and promise to Quebecers and to consumers, domestic consumers, you're going to have your energy rates held. You're going to have a bank of power over there that you're going to pay the lowest price for. There's never been this, the price is going to go up and up and up and you're paying for every development. It's not developed that way. Do you have any comments on any of those?
Oh, most definitely. First and foremost, the Emera arrangement is one done, in my view, out of desperation by us in trying to find a way to get around Quebec. And a desperate attempt in this sense that they get to own the transmission for 35 years to the mainland outright. And the other desperate part of it is that we're going to let them own a share of the transmission on the island. I believe it's 49% of what comes if it gets across the Gulf. As soon as it lands on the island, from there to Soldiers Pond outside of St. John's, they get to own 49% of that line, which means whatever transmission fees are charged on the island for getting the power to us, they get 49% of it. We're going to give 49% of our own transmission cost to a group in Nova Scotia. Not because it helps get energy to Nova Scotia, it's bringing energy to my house here in St. John's, to the corner store where I shop down the street, to the gas station on the corner where I buy my gasoline and so on. So I really don't understand that. And they've tried many times to suggest that there's no giveaway here, but the fact of the matter is they're going to put in $1.6 billion. They're going to get an asset that immediately is going to pay for itself, and they're going to make a profit on it. Just by virtue of charging these transmission fees, and they're going to own the line anyway, and then any transmission that goes to the mainland, other than their own block, if it ever does, they're going to charge the fees on that because they own it. And matter of fact, today it was announced, the head of Emera was on with the shareholder group, and they praised him to the hilt because he had made such a good deal and was going to make so much money for the company. The phrase was, "This is an investment for Emera with zero risk." No risk and all upside for profit. So the shareholders of Emera must be delighted, because if it ever goes ahead as it's outlined now, they will make a fortune. They'll get all their money back plus a fortune.
I don't understand, Roger, and you bring up probably one of the most important points, and that's this line coming to the island for domestic use and their ownership of any part of that. There's no logical equation or sense to taking a publicly traded Nova Scotian company, putting him into a grid and system that's owned by the people of this province that we're going to pay for, and PUB or any regulatory authority will give the amount to have paid back for a rate of return. And how they got an input into that is beyond me. It really is one of the more devastating pieces of this deal. And that piece smacks of a debate you were involved in a decade ago about privatization of hydro. I mean, this is a partial privatization of our publicly owned hydro corporation with its generation and transmission capabilities. There's no doubt about that. And as a matter of principle, I was in a government that was thinking about doing it and got convinced otherwise, because the people of the province, we understood, was totally opposed to it. And now all of a sudden we're not opposed to it because they're only going to own 49% of the transmission, and they're going to make private shareholders in Emera, which could just as easily be based in Quebec or British Columbia or New Brunswick or Ontario as Nova Scotia. Private shareholders from around the world are going to make money off the fact that we have to have electricity delivered from the coast of the Northern Peninsula to the rest of the island, inside the island. That was always done by hydro. Always done only by hydro, which we owned, which is not a problem.
They have all the capability. They don't need any outside expertise. They've done it forever. They're as good as anybody in the world at it. But now all of a sudden they need a partner. And, it really doesn't make any sense. So that part hasn't been a big part of the debate, I don't think. But it probably should be a bigger part of the debate that we're going to let private interest all of a sudden become part owners of Newfoundland Labrador Hydro. I mean, that caused an uproar 10 years ago. So what's happened to everybody? Did we all go to sleep?
I think you're right. I mean, that's a foot in the door. There's no two ways about it. And I don't know how well the people understand right now, as you and I talk, that we're going to have this company billing us for our own power from our own resource, with Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro that we own, taking a back seat to this company, Emera. And when you point out that, the best in the world, sure they are. They're comparable. The human resources and the abilities of Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro are equivalent to that of Hydro-Quebec or any utility globally. That company and its people have always maintained our system very well, our distribution system, our transmission system, in areas that they serve, obviously. And to say that Emera is now going to come in and take a piece of this, and then we as ratepayers, we as owners of the resource, are going to then be forced to pay a rate of return to a Nova Scotian company, it absolutely boggles the mind.
No doubt. And like I say, I don't know how much that'll be part of the debate in the legislature or not, and it hasn't been a big part of the debate in the public so far, but it certainly deserves a lot more discussion. So let me move on to the second part you mentioned about certainly the first half for sure of Premier Williams' tenure, when he was trying again to develop the Lower Churchill, and he ran into, and it was Gull Island they were talking about, by the way.
Yes.
It was Gull Island they always talked about. They never mentioned Muskrat Falls, and he ran into some snags trying to get the transmission through Quebec, which everybody does. And my take on it is this. He wanted to do it a different way, which is laudable, but the end result is getting it done, not necessarily exactly how you do it. If you get it done with the same end result, being that Newfoundlanders and Labradorians are the prime beneficiaries, we get to develop the resource, we make the profit, then some of the intermediate steps are sort of insignificant with that. But Danny Williams decided it was more good politics to lash out and become a Quebec basher than to try to get the work done. What he wanted to do, which is the ideal world, was to sell our energy in New York ourselves and just pay the transmission fee to Quebec. And, of course, Quebec, in defending their own interest, which is what every province should do, is what we should be doing. No need to bash them over that. Just because another province does a good job of defending its own interest, we'd expect it of our premier. They expect it of their premiers. So when they resisted, and they did come up with the argument that I've studied the court documents and said, well, listen, if that's what you want, if you're not going to sell the energy to us and let us sell it in New York, then that's your energy, and we have to tell you, unfortunately, that there's no room on the transmission line in Quebec for your energy. So we basically blew a gasket, because there would be room, you see, if you sold the energy to them. And a lot of people don't quite take the time to think that through. Part of the arrangement that I was working at with Quebec was this. Even when we were going to do Gull Island 10 years ago, we both knew, ourselves and Quebec, that there was not enough room on the transmission lines in Quebec for the full 22 or 2,300 megawatts that were going to come out of Gull Island. But if we sold it to Quebec at their border, then it became their energy, and then it became their problem to get it to market. They were going to pay us for all of it at the border, and they were going to pay us New York prices minus the cost of transmission, guaranteed with a floor price and indexed for inflation for the full life of the project. So that was the fundamentals of the deal. Danny wouldn't do that because he wanted to say, no, for the optics, I want to sell it and pay you the transmission charge. So what was different? when we were going to sell it to them, they acknowledged that they didn't have the capacity, just like they told Danny Williams they didn't have the capacity. But they said, since we will now own it once it's sold to us at the border, we will build the transmission lines ourselves. We will upgrade our own transmission lines because it's in our best interest to get it to market. And you will still get the same profit as if you had sold it yourself. And Danny Williams wasn't willing to go there. It's my biggest disappointment with Premier Williams in his time. He had so much political capital that I was thinking that he would spend maybe 3 or 4 years trying to work that out and then come back and tell the people of the province that, listen, we've tried everything. It's just not going to happen unless we sell it to them at the border. But when we sell it to them at the border, we are still going to be the prime beneficiaries. It'll be the same financial benefit to us as if we had sold it in New York ourselves. But he just couldn't bring himself to do it. And instead, because he was now getting a reputation as being the most popular premier ever in the province and ever in the country, he decided to, some good old Quebec bashing would help that side of his profile, even though it would make sure that the logical deal that still would have benefited was never going to get done. So that's my biggest disappointment, is that he decided to go that route and work on being more popular rather than rolling up his sleeves and then coming back to the people of the province and explaining why it was that he did have to sell the power to to Quebec, but that we weren't going to lose. We were still going to be the winners. We were still going to benefit. We were still going to make the same amount of money. It was still going to be a great deal. We came out on top. Quebec didn't do us, but he didn't make that speech, and that's my only disappointment in him, because he could have, and everybody in Newfoundland and Labrador would have believed him, and I certainly would have believed him, because from my own experience, I know that it would have been true, and I would have been being one of his biggest supporters. The other thing that you mentioned in relation to that is that nowhere in his first 6 years in office did we hear him as the Premier, or either of his Natural Resources Minister, or Ed Martin at Nalcor ever suggest that there was an energy crisis in Newfoundland and Labrador. The words were never uttered in the public. And as a matter of fact, that's one of the other fundamental problems that I have with it, Sue, is that when they went to the PUB, when Nalcor and the government went to the PUB, they restricted the terms of reference to saying, do we need the energy, and is this Muskrat Falls the low-cost option? And they did not convince the PUB that we needed the energy. They did not convince the PUB that there's a looming energy shortage. Neither did they convince, by the way, the Joint Environmental Review Panel of experts that they appointed to represent Canada and Newfoundland. They went through a full review process with them, and they didn't convince that group that there was a shortage or a need. Now, I heard Premier Dunderdale speak to the Federation of Municipalities just this past weekend in news clips, saying by 2019 we're going to be short of energy. The latest numbers that Nalcor themselves put before the PUB, looking for rate increases and talking about the rate increases that Newfoundland Power are looking for, don't verify that. These numbers, you can say it, but someone has to just ask very basic grade 3, grade 4, grade 5 questions. Okay, if there's a shortage, how much energy do we have on the island? How many kilowatts can we produce? How much energy are we using? How many kilowatts are we using? And the numbers show that we're in excess. And we've been in excess every year. We're in excess next year, according to the predictions, and the year after, and the year after, and the year after. And there's minimal growth predicted well into the future. So where this great crisis and need is, and, I was appalled a couple of times to hear Minister Kennedy on an open line program saying, the choices for us in a year or two are going to be, do people heat their homes, or are they going to have to put on a coat and go out to the mall to stay warm? Because we're not going to have enough energy for people to even keep the electricity on in their houses to keep them warm. I mean, that's just pure, nonsensical, poor political rhetoric, not based on any evidence whatsoever. So that one still puzzles me. The fundamental question still is one that I've not bought into in terms of there being an actual need. If there is at all, and if we are that short, then what I wrote in a letter to the editor recently is that the Premier, Nalcor, and the Natural Resources Minister have been derelict in their duties if they've allowed us on this island to come that short to a crisis without telling us and without doing some planning other than this. So if this doesn't work, like next week or the week after, if the financing doesn't work, or if the loan guarantee from the Government of Canada doesn't come through, or if Emera backs out of the deal because they have till sometime at the end of next year to even think about it, what happens then? What's plan B if this thing doesn't come together? Or do we just go foolhardily ahead, and if it goes a bit astray, just jack up the rates a bit higher to the ratepayers on the island and, head first into the gale? Never mind what comes forward, there's always one bailout, and the one bailout is put the rates up higher for the ratepayers on the island. And one other thing you mentioned before, that's always been a thought to me. I've read the provincial energy plan produced by the provincial Conservative government when Danny Williams was the Premier, and Ed Byrne, I believe, was the Energy Minister when it was released. And I read it in detail. And they talk about, and there were a lot of speeches made about the great energy warehouse that we have here on the island and in Labrador. No doubt about it, the potential exists. But the one thing that's lacking that you just touched on in your commentary was, where was the part that said that if we develop this great warehouse, that one of the things that will happen for the rest of us on the island, like it already has happened in Western Labrador and in Churchill Falls, and to a lesser extent in Happy Valley Goose Bay, because they still enjoy relatively low rates. Where is the advantage of developing all this so that, as in Quebec, they carve out a portion of it to make sure that our rates don't go up? We're the owners of all this great wealth. Why don't they say we'll carve out, 1,000 megawatts of this at a certain price to make sure that the rates here on the island for you people that own it don't increase at all? It's not there. It's not mentioned. Matter of fact, it's the exact opposite. It says that if we need some extra cash for Nalcor, because, by the way, you and I and the rest of us, we own Nalcor too, but we're not allowed to ask any questions. They're shrouded in secrecy. We own it, but we're not allowed to know anything about how they operate. But Nalcor is going to have the right to just jack up our rates if they run short of money. That's going to be, a carte blanche right they're going to be given. No protection of the rates, no protection for the ordinary rate payer, but just a carte blanche sheet of paper that says to them, if you run into any money trouble at all, put up the rates on the island.
It's this whole, the whole, and you just mentioned some very important points, and the demand issue, I think, is one, and I've heard as well, I think Premier Dunderdale mentioning 2019 and perhaps the Minister mentioning 2017 for running out of power to the point where, you put a brick in your bed. We've really got to consider, and you are right, I mean, if we have an energy corporation that all the while they were negotiating with Hydro-Quebec to do the Gull Island project had no problems with demand, and the minute that stopped, the problem was demand on the island, it's got to raise some red flags. I mean, I've studied, as you probably know, the Hydro Corporation, every single report, annual report they've had. They've always talked about, the need for development of new resources. I think we're supposed to run out in 79 and 81, 85, 89. Every single one of them were wrong. Primarily, of course, because what has happened is there's no industrial development on the island, with the exception of the project that you're the Premier of. We'll talk about that a little later, and that would be Voisey's Bay. But the fish plants that are closing, schools that are closing, the two paper mills that have closed, and again, back to the efficiencies of, what is the efficient, when you build a house today, what is that house compared to 40 years ago with respect to energy efficiency appliances, right down to the light bulbs? And where is the efficiency planning even? If we're this short, if we're in this much trouble, I would have to believe that Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro and Newfoundland Power would be out every single day with a massive undertaking to cause all of us to become more efficient very, very quickly. And I don't mean little ads here and there. I mean a severe program of reduction, and yet we don't see that.
No, there's no sign of any of that, Sue, and that, it calls that whole area into question. But we're then supposed to just blindly accept what Ed Martin says. He tells it to the Premier. She reiterates it to us, and we're just supposed to believe it. We're not supposed to question that ourselves, even though the reports and the facts of the matter speak differently. Let me give you one example. I just did some moose hunting. We needed a new deep freeze. Purchased, by the way, a bigger deep freeze than I've ever had because we needed. We got lucky at moose hunting, and hopefully going to give away some moose sometime soon with the proper notes and so on that's supposed to accompany it. But what was the advertisement for it is that it's bigger capacity. But guess what? I'm going to use less energy to run that one than I am my smaller one, because of the new energy-efficient ways that they are now developed. And that's the way of the world. Every appliance, everything that you look at, our light bulbs and so on, these days that are on the market, there's a new energy-efficient version of it that does all the same things you did before, but actually uses less energy than we used to in the past. And by the way, if we really had a problem with that, Nalcor itself has dismissed the call for conservation measures. And I did hear Mr. Gilbert Bennett's quote. He's apparently the vice president in charge of Muskrat Falls, saying that, well, we didn't really pay too much attention to conservation because Newfoundlanders and Labradorians are not used to it. It's not something that we've done, so like we didn't really think we could accomplish a lot with conservation because we're not used to it. Well, the example that I use is I live here in St. John's, and up to a couple of years ago, we didn't have garbage recycling either. We didn't have a recycling initiative. But I tell you what, I think there's a 75 to 80% take-up on it within the city of St. John's and Mount Pearl, and they just got awarded, by the way, internationally in Washington for their Curb It program for being one of the best recycling initiatives on the planet. So Newfoundlanders and Labradorians in this area where it's offered embraced it wholeheartedly. Just like if we were told seriously that there was an energy crisis, I'd probably go out if I had to in some small way and maybe turn off the lamppost that I've got in front of my house. I don't need that. It's more of a decoration than anything. And, towns and cities around would probably turn off some of the light poles that are lit all night long. Or maybe turn them off after 2 o'clock instead of leaving them on. But no one's been asked to do those kinds of things because Mr. Bennett said we're not used to it. We don't do that, so we didn't think there could be much accomplished by doing that. But if we have the kind of crisis they'd like for us to believe that we have, it's very, very easy to have a 3 or 4 or 5% saving on anybody's electricity bills with very minimal effort. And they're only predicting a growth of 0.5 to 1%. So if you save 3, you don't only not need it, you actually gain. You're further ahead of the game. But they don't seem to want to go there. You also mentioned, Sue, industrial development on the island, that there won't be. And by the way, with Muskrat Falls, the way it's been described to us now, there can't be any industrial development on the island because of Muskrat Falls either, because 20% of it right away goes to Emera free of charge over to Nova Scotia. They say they're going to close down Holyrood, which is another 500 megawatts at its peak, 300 and something when it's not at peak. So all the energy is gone. The 800 megawatts that's going to come from Muskrat Falls, if you're going to close Holyrood, which they say they're going to do, and that's another topic as well. Closing Holyrood might be desirable from an environmental point of view, but it's not necessary. It is not an absolute need and a necessity to do it. And I know there are some environmentalists that would argue with that point. But again, I'm a pro-development person. We've lived with these kind of developments, and sometimes there's a trade-off that you make. It would be desirable, yes. Would it be nice if we didn't have to use Holyrood? Sure it would. But do we absolutely, must we? Is there something that says we have to close it down before its useful life expires in another 30 years or so? I don't think so. I don't see it at all if that's a choice. And if that's what's creating the need that we have to close that down, then when you replace that energy, there's no point in anybody coming here looking for energy for industrial development because there's none coming from Muskrat Falls anyway. And the other piece is now they'll make us believe on a certain day that there mightn't be anything coming to the island because we're going to need all of it in Labrador for mining. So, I mean, what is it? It can't be everything. It's only 800 megawatts, and it can't meet all these needs. So I don't see any prospect for Muskrat Falls contributing to any industrial development on the island. And you know this as well as anybody, probably better than most, that if it's going to be for industrial development, again, it has to be sold at an industrial rate, which is a whole lot lower than what we pay in our homes. So again, it's going to be a subsidy. It's going to be, you're going to have to give it to the industrial user for a lot less than it actually costs you to produce it. And that's one of my whole issues about this project when they talk about Labrador and mining developments. I understand, I've talked to some of the mining company executives in the last little while, that there are 3 or 4 or 5 projects that could use the 800 megawatts and then some. My information is that there's projects that would require upwards of 1,000 megawatts. And by the way, Sue, some of them are saying that their start date, they'd like to be up and running by 2015. Now, did you hear the number I just said? 2015. If we build Muskrat Falls, it's not even going to be built till 2017, maybe 2018 if there's any delays. So where are they going to get the energy in those first 3 years? I know and you know they're going to buy it from Hydro-Quebec from the Upper Churchill. So if they're going to buy it, because that's the only place they can get it, if they're going to buy it from Hydro-Quebec from the Upper Churchill for 3 years, why wouldn't they want to do it for 20 years or 30 years? Because they can get it a whole lot cheaper from Hydro-Quebec and the Upper Churchill, where it's only costing 2 cents to produce it. Well, less than that, actually. Than they can from Muskrat Falls, where it's going to cost 7 or 8 cents to produce it. And then, of course, on this mining issue in Labrador, now you've got the complication of the Iron Ore Company of Canada, which has its own energy contract coming up for renewal with the government. I think it's next year. And they're not talking about it publicly. The government is frightened to death to talk about it publicly because the Iron Ore Company of Canada is currently accessing the cheapest energy in North America to run their plants. And, of course, any other iron ore miner in Labrador will want the same rate, or they're going to claim that there's an unfair advantage, that there's a subsidy to IOC. They'll probably challenge under NAFTA and other agreements. So the government is into a box. They know that they can't jack up the rates to IOC to any appreciable amount because that'll affect their bottom line and threaten one of the most successful enterprises in the province over the last 40 years or so. And the other iron ore companies, never mind the other mining entities with a different type of product, but those that are in there for iron ore are certainly going to come in the door saying, well, if you're selling it to IOC for 3 cents, you certainly can't be expecting me to pay 7 or 8 or 10, can you? So you can see the bind they're in. So they might try to grandfather IOC at their lower rate and try to convince the others they have to pay a bit more, but none of them expect to pay the 7 or 8 cents that it costs to actually produce the energy at Muskrat Falls. That's not in the cards. So they're all looking for energy less than that cost. So if we're going to build Muskrat Falls to fuel economic development in Labrador through mining, then we'd better be doing it on a cost-benefit analysis basis, which I've never heard mentioned, by the way, which would show a cost-benefit analysis could and would show that the benefits to the province from the mining activity, the jobs, the royalties, the income taxes, the business taxes, and so on, would more than offset the money you're going to lose on the power plant, on the production of the energy. So if that's the case, why aren't they out there now saying we're already starting to do some cost-benefit analyses on these mining ventures? Because otherwise, if they're not doing that, then it means that maybe we're going to have the ratepayers on the island again pay a little bit more so that the mining companies in Labrador, if they access Muskrat Falls power, can get it at a low enough rate to keep them competitive with IOC and other mining enterprises. So there's a real quandary there for the government that ties directly into the Iron Ore Company of Canada, a long-standing, successful company, and of course Wabush Mines as well, a long-standing successful enterprise in Lab West that, by the way, has proven resources that go out for probably close to another 100 years. So if they're going to keep that going, which I suggest everybody wants them to do, they're going to keep the energy rates low, and there's going to be a lot of pressure on them to match those low energy rates for the other mining enterprises, and all those low energy rates in Labrador can only be gotten from the same source that IOC is getting them. They can get them from Hydro-Quebec, from the Upper Churchill. But of course, Danny Williams, now that he's a private citizen representing a mining company, says, I don't want to buy energy from Quebec. I don't want to buy energy from Quebec. I think he's doing a disservice to the shareholders. You know, if I was a shareholder in that company, I would be outraged that somebody is saying on behalf of my money that I've invested in the company that they don't want to get the cheapest possible power they can get. Your job is to get the cheapest energy you can get. The cheapest energy available in Labrador today is from the Upper Churchill, which you buy through Hydro-Quebec. And there's some of the companies are already in talks with Hydro-Quebec. Obviously, the one that Danny Williams is part of is not, because I guess he figures that he can influence this government to build Muskrat Falls and give him a subsidy and sell it to him and his company for less than what it costs to produce it. So I think there's a huge conflict of interest there with the former premier being directly involved in a company that's directly lobbying the government for low energy from a project when they can get lower energy from a project in Labrador that's already built, being the Upper Churchill. But again, that's another issue that doesn't seem to get a lot of public discussion and maybe won't, maybe doesn't deserve it. But I think it's a curiosity and something that should be on people's minds and should raise questions.
Well, obviously everything, you know, and everything has to be examined. When we're talking about $8 billion and upward, you know, we can't be making mistakes a second time. We can't be doing anything wrong with this. You and I have discussed in the past, a good while ago now, but we've discussed and we look at, you know, potential industrial development in Labrador with its massive resources. They're adjacent to the hydro resources, and also the traditional industrial development using hydroelectric power. You know, the three bigs, I suppose, in industrial development being the power, the access to the raw resource, and then your labor component. And where in northern, particularly, you know, northern areas, that's where we see all the aluminum smelters, whether it's in Iceland or now Greenland and Russia and Quebec. If all these mining companies have needs and will have further needs, and you know, they're discovering more ore bodies and things of that nature, where is the evidence that the government has sat down with them on an industrial basis, looked at the development of Gull Island for the purpose of industrial use, wherein, yes, the power price might be a bit lower, but we're talking about 5,000-10,000 jobs and a developed economy. Where is the evidence that even took place?
In my view, there is none. And every time that the Minister of Natural Resources, Mr. Kennedy, or the Premier gets challenged on the issue, or even Ed Martin at Nalcor, when they talk, you know, they throw out the notion that we're all these opportunities that are in Labrador for mining. But then when they say, as soon as they're asked a question along the lines of what you were just discussing, so what kind of rates would they do? What kind of power per? Well, we're not, you know, we haven't really entered into those discussions. We're not advanced in those discussions. We haven't really talked to them about it because right now we're really busy in just trying to finish off our arrangements with the Emera, finish off the loan guarantee with the Government of Canada, get the engineering done, get the latest financial numbers done. You know, I don't use the terminology that they use. All we're doing is we're getting updated numbers. So if somebody wants to try to make them sound really fancy by calling them Decision Gate 3 or something else, that's fine. But all we're trying to do is get the latest numbers that describe the costs surrounding this whole venture and this whole project. So interestingly enough, one part of the project, again, that a lot of people have overlooked, Sue, is that there is, if Muskrat Falls is developed, going to be a line that ties it back in to the Upper Churchill. And I think when that was questioned in the early days, the answers were largely around the whole concept of saying, well, We need that for management of the flow of the river. The upper Churchill and Muskrat got to be tied in, the generation, the water flow on the river, being able to have energy go back and forth between the two plants and so on, just proper management, proper control. But one of the parts that they didn't mention was that Ed Martin has mentioned this a couple of times themselves, is that they still in the long term see the development of Gull Island as part of it too. And going back to the upper Churchill is critical because that's the way the energy is going to go. Every time even Ed Martin has talked about Gull Island as the next step in the project, he doesn't talk about building a bigger line to the island and a bigger line to Nova Scotia and then a bigger line out through New Brunswick down to the United States. He talks about taking the Gull Island energy, the 2,300 megawatts, and shipping it through Quebec. So he says that's why we're still in court in Quebec, trying to get our way through Quebec and trying to get it straightened out so that we can export the energy. So the big part of this project that makes financial sense is still on the books at Nalcor as an export project through Quebec. And the idea of coming to the island is to me a window dressing and a show that doesn't make much financial sense at all. And I've yet to see any numbers that show where that can be viable in and of and by itself. So, the cost-benefit analysis issue was raised a few years back when one of the smelting giants, I believe it was Alcoa at the time, did make an overture to Newfoundland Labrador Hydro and the government of Newfoundland, asking if they could actually build the Lower Churchill themselves. And you may well be aware of that from some of the research and work you've done with Hydro-Quebec, because they're also a big customer of Hydro-Quebec. And their prospect and their whole proposal at the time, Sue, was that we'll build the dam at no cost to the Newfoundland Labrador government. You just let us access the energy. We'll build the smelters, the aluminum smelters, in Happy Valley Goose Bay in Labrador. We'll employ the people. We'll use the power, and that's how you'll get the benefits. And at the end of the day, the cost-benefit analysis showed that it was probably not bad in terms of the numbers being about even, that, we would have to give them total access to the energy for, say, 50 years, and then it would revert back to us. Not much different, I guess, than giving Emera the line for 35 years, and then we can buy it back from them. But the optics of it were just so bad at the time that we were going to build a power plant in Labrador, and Newfoundland and Labrador wasn't going to own it till 50 years later. Well, we're not going to own the transmission line to Nova Scotia either for 35 years. We're not even going to own the entire transmission line on the island for 35 years. We're going to give part of that away. So, but the numbers in terms of could the building of the plant, the aluminum smelters, the jobs created, the royalties, the taxes, the business taxes and so on, bring as much money to the province as the sale of the energy would? The numbers on that were very, very close. They probably could make a case.
Roger, where we need to, and we really need to talk about this a bit more, because the successful contracts for hydro development all over the place are typically with these industrial partners, and what makes them different is it's not to extract raw resource. It is to do secondary processing. And that secondary processing has not been talked about at all. And, of course, that's the long-term jobs in Labrador. At the end of this process that they're talking about, I think I asked at one of the hearings, and the answer I got was there may be 50 long-term jobs. Well, with the amount of power we're talking about, if we're talking about the Lower Churchill, it isn't unreasonable to expect 5, 8, 10,000 jobs. I mean, it develops an entire economy. It's an industrial, that industrial partnership that does a couple of things, and we'll get into this because you've done one of these projects. It's not just extracting ore, but it's then taking that ore and turning it into something that gives the long-term economic benefits, that gives you a reason to use and develop the natural resource that you have. And it makes sense. Like you said, well, Emera would also own it for this long, and the same thing is almost the same thing. Emera will provide no long-term jobs. Emera is not going to do secondary processing in this province. And so this is why I say to you, why do we not talk about secondary processing and the normal contractual arrangements throughout the world, wherever jurisdiction has hydropower, that they partner with that type of industrial company in order to get increase your population, lower your unemployment, raise your salaries, improve quality of life, develop and build Labrador. Why are we not seeing this?
I don't know. Again, that one has me puzzled as well, Sue, because it seems that in a decade, in 10 years or so, we've done a complete about-face. Like when we were doing Voisey's Bay 10 years ago, in doing the actual deal, the whole mantra was you were not just going to take the nickel and ship it off to Sudbury. That was the whole thing. That you had to do the secondary processing. It had to be turned into a finished product in Newfoundland and Labrador. And there was some criticism of the arrangement because we gave them 3 or 4 years supply to ship out to help them raise the money so they could build the plant that they're now finishing out in Long Harbour. 3,500 people employed building a plant that's as big as the east end of St. John's, and going to be 500 full-time jobs for what looks like the next 70 to 75 years, just based on the size of the resource in Labrador. And the other thing that was announced this week is that they're going to bring in now some concentrate from Indonesia to run it through the plant to check and see if they can bring in to Long Harbour raw material from other parts of the globe, because this is going to be the newest, most modern, most energy efficient plant in the world for processing nickel. And the other part of that project as well was that, by the way, copper is one of the one of the subsidiary parts of this. There's copper in these particular ores as well, and part of the agreement was that if the copper from Voisey's Bay, along with other copper finds in the province, become large enough to warrant building a copper processing plant, then they have to do that as well. But the difference today, 10 years later, is that these mining interests that we're all hearing about in Labrador, only one of them is even suggesting that they might build a pellet plant, that they might pelletize it. In other words, instead of sending a rock, they'll make it into a nice round little lump, but it'll still be raw iron ore. But nobody is being challenged to put in any secondary processing, and I guess it's because the biggest one up there, IOC and Wabash Mines, they never ever had to do any real secondary processing, but at least there were permanent, long-time, forever jobs in a pelletizing plant, along with the mining operation. But even these new enterprises are not even being challenged to build a pelletizing plant. Most of them, 3 of the 4 that I've heard of, their plan says we just want to extract it and ship it out, by the way, through Quebec, which is the issue that Yvonne Jones has been raising publicly lately, is that why haven't we ever said you got to ship it out through Labrador? How come it's a given that you put it on the railway and you go into Quebec with it? If we're really trying to maximize the benefit for us, why haven't we ever thought about having a rail link into Happy Valley Goose Bay and ship it out ourselves, and all the handling jobs and the shipping jobs and the port jobs and everything else that go with that, along with running the rail line? But that doesn't seem to be even on the radar for the current government. They're talking about all these great potential projects which should take us into the next 50, 60, 70 years, but there's no thought that because they might all happen, that maybe now there's enough in terms of the total bulk of the activity to warrant doing some of the handling right in Labrador instead of just going on with the age-old practice of sending it out through Quebec because it's convenient for everybody else. So there's no thought that you have to stand up, put your foot down, leave it in the ground for a while and say, no, not until you start talking about some really secondary long-term benefits here are we even going to let this stuff come out of the ground. Right now it just says, get them the energy for as cheap as you can, even cheaper than what we're going to produce it, and let them take it and let them ship it off to China. And then all the jobs, of course, will be over in China. So that doesn't seem, that part of the agenda doesn't seem to be out there like it was a decade ago.
I think, I can't believe we only have 25 minutes left. There's a bit to go through, but let me take you back a few years, and I'd like to hear your commentary on this. When the Conservatives were in opposition, you were the Premier, Voisey's Bay was on the table. Development costs of Voisey's Bay, you can touch on that, who was responsible. The demand for secondary processing, or they weren't going to get their hands on the ore. the additional research and development that came along with that, and the royalty regime and so on. And now I'm seeing them try to compare the two projects. Do you want to have a go at that?
Yeah, I think I've been a bit puzzled by the way this has been handled. I guess it's come up because there's supposedly going to be a debate, and the current government and Premier Dunderdale is saying, well, the debate, the template should be Voisey's Bay, because that's the only time we've really had a debate like that, and it'll be just like that. It shouldn't be just like that, Sue, because there are zero similarities between what we were debating with Voisey's Bay and what's going to be debated this time. In Voisey's Bay, there was a resource which is a very nickel-rich, copper-rich resource on the north coast of Labrador, which was going to be, someone was going to get permission to mine it. You know, the government wasn't going to, people in Newfoundland and Labrador weren't the owners of a company. Some of them were shareholders in Inco, I guess. But as a people, the 500,000 of us weren't going to put together a company and form a mine and all this kind of stuff. So some big corporation was going to come in and invest several $1 billion to take this out of the ground and turn it into some kind of a finished marketable product. And the deal was that, yes, you can do that. We will give you permission to spend, I think it ended up being something like $5 or $6 billion that the owners of that company spent in Labrador alone. They're spending another $3.5 billion now out in Long Harbour. So that company and its owners from around the world were going to put in several $1 billion. In return for that, we were going to let them take the product, but only if they then made it in this province into a marketable secondary product. And we weren't going to let them take it to existing plants that they already had, by the way. They already had the capability to refine this stuff into a marketable product. We said, no, we don't care about that. We have to get the benefits of the secondary processing jobs. And they have to pay for that, and they're paying for it as we speak out in Long Harbour. So altogether, in that few years, it'll be about $10 billion. They had to put up a whole bunch of research and development. They built a whole complex at Memorial University, which is still there, and in which they're doing research into geology and all of those kinds of things. They're sponsoring seats in there for graduate students. They built hospitals in Labrador. They helped build schools. They put in that money, not the taxpayers of Newfoundland and Labrador. But in this case, we're going to have a debate that talks about a resource that we own again. This time it happens to be water, which can be turned into electricity. But the people that are putting in the money are me and you. It's my money and your money and every Newfoundlander's and Labradorian's own money, because we're going to put it in through the rates that we pay for electricity. That's the only way this is getting paid for. So it's a completely different concept. They're having a debate about whether or not we ourselves, as individual Newfoundlanders and Labradorians, should reach into our own pockets and develop an energy project. I don't mind doing that, by the way. I don't mind doing that. If it's going to benefit us in, do a cost-benefit analysis of jobs and this and that and something else that's mining. Do something to show that there's something in it for me. But the only thing I see in it for me as an ordinary Newfoundlander and Labradorian is guaranteed electricity rate increases for 55 years in a row. That's what I get for it. I don't get cheap electricity anymore. I get electricity that's guaranteed to go up 55 years in a row. There can never be a day where it goes down, like gas prices are going to go down 9 cents tomorrow. That can't happen for 55 years, no matter what happens. This project gets paid for over its 55-year financing life from my pocket through my light bill and everybody else's light bill. That's their only guaranteed source of revenue. If they sell some of it to a mining company, I got to subsidize it. I have to subsidize it. My rate's got to go up a little bit higher so that Nalcor can make a profit, because the mining company is going to get the energy for less than it cost me to make it in Labrador. if I ever sell any of it to the mainland, if any of it ever does go beyond Nova Scotia where it's going for free, if some of it should actually happen to trickle into New Brunswick somewhere, because there's all kinds of problems there too, Sue, by the way, with terms of capacity on the lines. Just like capacity doesn't exist in Quebec for the full 2,000 megawatts of Gull Island, capacity doesn't exist beyond Nova Scotia for any significant amount of energy to be sold anywhere in the eastern United States. If we do sell it, the market prices today that we're seeing, even before Muskrat Falls is built, is that companies like Hydro-Quebec and others are selling energy for 8 and 10 and 12-year contracts for 5 cents. My understanding is going to take us 7 to 8 cents to make it in Labrador, and another 15 or 20 cents or more to bring it over the lines to get it to them. So our cost of getting it to Maine is over 20 cents, and I'm going to sell it to them for 5. So again, my light bill has to go up to cover that loss so that Nalcor, which is my company, can show a profit.
Well, I'll
and
tell
Mr.
you.
Martin and others can go around and be a big hero and say, well, Nalcor had a profitable year. I guess they're going to have a profitable year.
Yeah,
If they're going to keep jacking up my light bill, there's no trouble to do. Sure, that's the easiest thing in the world to do for them.
It really
but
makes
it's not
no
the
sense.
easiest thing in the world.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, if you're not going to do it with an industrial partner for the purpose of secondary processing, and obviously there will be some, they'll get power at a cheaper rate. They'll be involved, however, in the capital costs, and they're going to provide 2,000-3,000 jobs. If you're not going to do that, and it's not solely for domestic use, because clearly we're not going to spend $8 billion to replace Holyrood. Where on earth can they do these things without first having power contract agreements in place? We don't have a power contract signed with anybody in the United States. We don't have a power contract signed with anybody in New Brunswick, Ontario. Then you go on power contracts. That's how you pay for it. We don't even have that.
And Sue, and here that leads to another major problem that we now have. Even if they do put together a power purchase arrangement with a mining company, supposing they do put together a power purchase arrangement with a mining company, well, with the laws now under their new Freedom of Information Act and the way that Nalcor is treated, you and I and anybody else in the province, we're not allowed to know what it is. Because under the whole idea that there's some confidentiality here in the business case, I've already heard them say, well, we can't really disclose to the public what we're going to sell energy to Alderaan for, because then there's another company going to go in and we can't really let them know what their competitors get energy for. Now, that's the biggest pile of nonsense I've ever heard in my whole entire life. We, as Newfoundlanders and Labradorians, own the company. We own the energy. We have a right to know how much the people that are now running the company on our behalf are giving our energy to these companies for. There's no confidentiality in that. By the way, in the Voisey's Bay Agreement, every single item like that is spelled out in a contract, which is on a website that everybody in the province can see if they want to see it, including the fact that Voisey's Bay was guaranteed one thing about energy, that they would get energy at the same industrial rate as other industrial users on the island, people like Come By Chance and the paper companies and so on. Whatever we were charging them, then Inco, Voisey's Bay, Valley now would be charged the same rate. Now, what's the big secret about that? What's the big problem with the business case about that? That's being open and accountable and honest. But right now, they've set it up to say, and I've heard Mr. Martin say it, I've heard Minister Kennedy say it, and I've heard Premier Dunnerdale say it. We cannot tell you what we're going to sell energy to these companies for, because it would be a breach of confidentiality in the business contracts that we're going to put in place with these companies. Even if they sell energy, they're suggesting to somebody in Maine. They're saying that under the Freedom of Information, which Nalcor is exempt from totally, They cannot tell us what they sold it for. We already have an example. Nalcor and the government took the contract from Hydro-Quebec for selling the recall power into the States, and they gave it to Emera. We have been asking for 3 years how much money Emera made for us and what they were selling the energy for compared to Hydro-Quebec. They won't tell us. The only way we can find out is by reading the annual reports of Nalcor and Newfoundland Labrador Hydro, in which we discover that the revenues that come into the company have gone down since they changed the contract because Emera is getting less money for us than Hydro-Quebec used to.
It's really bad.
But they won't tell us.
No,
they will not tell us, and we're not going to find out unless somebody raises, a real racket and gets people to come to their senses and say, never mind this secrecy and this confidentiality. You don't treat private companies and public enterprises the same way. One private company dealing with another private company has every right to tell everybody else to go away, don't bother me, I don't have you tell you that. Once you involve a public entity like Newfoundland Labrador Hydro, which we own, Nalcor, which we own, then the other company dealing with them understands, by the way, everywhere else in the world, that everybody's going to know because the people that own the company, which are the residents of the province, want to know what they're selling their energy for. So there's no big secret. There's no big advantage to anybody in the business, in the marketplace, in private enterprise, because everybody knows that when you go to this public utility, this is the rate you're going to get. But they're over there saying, we can't tell you that. So what are we supposed to believe? That
industrial rates are public. Industrial rates with all utilities everywhere. You can read industrial rates. You can read the agreements. You can see what the rates are. Just to our neighbor there, just go up and read the agreements. We know what the industrial rates are. We know that if a company, because they do, by the way, have a fairly significant energy efficiency process in Hydro-Quebec, where they reward large companies, and it's happened even this year, where if they reduce energy use and they come up with efficiencies, obviously there's a benefit to them, and of course, therefore, a benefit to the people of Quebec. But not having industrial rates and not being able to see them is really unheard of. This is taking things to a whole new level. Because we only have 12 minutes left, and I think it's important, one I'm going to point out that I did confirm with you, and it's important, I think, to all people, whether or not it's a full discussion, it's important that people know. You're not a director on a mining company or an energy company, and you're speaking as a retired citizen, correct?
Yes, as a retired premier and a retired politician who still has an abiding interest in what happens in Newfoundland, Labrador. That's the motivation that had me in politics in the first place. I wasn't looking for anything for myself because, in fact, Sue, I used to say to all my friends that I made a higher wage, by the way, as a politician than I made as a school teacher.
Yes.
So I figured I was doing all right anyway. That was good enough. I got a raise. I made more money than I did if I was doing what my other profession was, which was teaching school. That was enough of a benefit for me. I sit on no boards. I'm on no panels. I don't get any remuneration for anything. Matter of fact, when it came to Voisey's Bay, one of the things that we actually put into the agreement, which people can look at online because it's all public, one of the things we put in there as a result of a debate in the legislature, because the opposition leader, Mr. Williams at the time, was saying, you fellows are all doing this, you're going to line your pockets. I said, look, there's nothing in this for us. And I said, to make sure that not me nor anybody else that's in this legislature at this time on the government side, there's an actual clause in the agreement that says that no one who was in the House of Assembly at that time on the government side who voted for the Voisey's Bay Agreement could ever take a position with Voisey's Bay or Inco or any of their subsidiaries. We wanted to make sure it was crystal clear that there was no one in there voting for this because there was going to be some kind of a payoff for them or a benefit for them or so on. That's why I find it, a bit strange now that just a year or so out of office, we have another former premier, Danny Williams, who agreed with that concept, who's now on the board of directors and a special advisor to a mining company, who's trying to lobby the government to get cheap energy from a project that he announced but didn't get done. But he wants it done, and he's even saying, which really amazes me, that he'd rather buy energy from that company than buy it from Hydro-Quebec through Upper Churchill when he knows in his heart and soul that the energy cost will be lower for the company if they take the cheaper stuff from the Upper Churchill than the more expensive stuff. Now, why would anybody want to be in a business where you want to take one of your fundamental base costs? You know, there's a cost for this product, there's a cost of transportation, there's a cost of electricity. These are all into whether or not you can make a profit. Why would anyone in a business case want to take one of those fundamental costs, which is significant in mining, which is electricity, and pay more for it than you have to? That
unless,
I don't
of
understand.
course,
That's beyond, that's totally beyond me, unless, again, he thinks he can convince this government to give it to him for the same price that the other companies that IOC and Wabash are getting, which means that the rest of us on the island got to pay a bigger subsidy. Our rates have to go even higher to pay for the money we're then going to lose on that electricity that we'll give to the mining companies at a lower cost.
Well, I think you just explained that everything is shrouded, and unless we go for which we would not know about, of course, a subsidization by us that would lower it beyond a competitive cost from another jurisdiction, because that mining company, like any other mining companies, are doing what's best for their profit and their shareholders. So the only way that would work, I guess, is that the subsidization, which we can't know about, would be such that we as ratepayers would also then be paying for that. So, I mean, there's so many questions, Roger, that we need some serious answers to, and obviously we need full disclosure and we need full information, which we're not getting. Because we only have 8 minutes left, believe it or not, I wanted you to touch briefly, if you could, on the sanctioning process. And I think that's important because you sat as Premier, you sat in the House of Assembly, you've gone through processes of development. What do you think of this process, whether it be through PUB, these assumptions that companies are given and told to use when they're supposed to be doing an independent report, the discussion and discourse with the public or any critics of the deal? How are you finding this whole process from where you sat as Premier?
Well, I think that presently, I think the jury is sort of already in on that one in Newfoundland and Labrador. My understanding of it is that most people, even those that support this project, would say that the government has seriously mishandled the process of explaining it to people and trying to get it sanctioned. Because we should all understand this. The government, an elected government, does not need to take any project development issue like this to the House of Assembly. There was no law requiring the government that I led to take the Voisey's Bay project to the House of Assembly for a vote. There was no law suggesting that back in the 60s that the Smallwood government had to take the Upper Churchill arrangement to the House for a vote. It's done basically so that there can be a wider range discussion, so that there can be more information, so that people can get a better sense of comfort. But so far, the discussion of this hasn't given rise to a greater sense of comfort. And then the combination of that and the freedom of information clampdown, in which you can't get certain information. And Premier Dunderdale can say till she's blue in the face that we've given out thousands of thousands of pages of information. We've given out more information than people ever saw in their lives. That may be true in terms of volume, but the critical pieces in terms of where are your power purchase agreements, who do you have them signed with, how much are you going to sell the energy for, what is the actual rate going to be for energy on the island? We don't know that yet. Those kinds of things that are the real crux of the matter, they don't tell us. And they say, well, I can't redisclose that. And the latest numbers, which are now sent off to Manitoba Hydro International, why don't they, as was suggested yesterday by the gentleman from the Atlantic Institute for Maritime Studies, the independent group out of Nova Scotia. Why don't they give it back to our Public Utilities Board? This is a once-in-a-lifetime major initiative. Why don't they give them the full, unfettered 180-day review that they're given in Nova Scotia? That's what their Public Utilities Board got. And they can do what they like. They can talk about other alternatives. They can call whatever witnesses they want. They can do what they like, and they got the whole gamut before them. Our PUB was hamstrung to say you can only look at this particular project. Do we need the energy, which they were inconclusive on, and is it the least cost? And they said, well, sure, you didn't give us enough information for us to make a decision. And then the reaction of the government was to say, well, what do you expect from that bunch of bums? So if you don't agree, you're a bunch of bums. That's the only response that they've had consistently through the whole piece. So their very best attempts at explanation and their very best attempts at giving open information and allowing, as Jerome Kennedy said 10 years ago before he went into politics, and which was quoted last week, allowing common sense, smart, intelligent Newfoundlanders and Labradorians to look at all the information and make up their own minds. Never mind just listening to what the government says is good for you. That's what he said before he got elected. And now he's in there part of a government that won't even show you the information. And won't. So, the whole debate there it doesn't have to happen by law. It happens as a matter of course. It's good politics when it's done right. I think when we finished the debate with Voisey's Bay, if I'm not mistaken, some group, not the government, but some group did a public opinion poll that showed close to 80% of the people in Newfoundland and Labrador agreed with the Voisey's Bay deal, despite the best efforts of the opposition to say you could drive a Mack truck through it and through the loopholes and all those kinds of things. Despite all of that, when they heard the debate in the House and looked at the details and got the documents presented to them, by the way, signed documents between the government and INCO at the time, no freedom of information secrecy, everything passed over, every detail of what was going to be done over the life of the project was in those pages, and they looked at it, and close to 80% said, that makes sense, despite what the opposition said. Here, there's going to be continued problems because no matter what happens in a debate, they've already set the tone and tenor to say there's certain things that I can't tell you that had to be privileged because they're sensitive to the business case or they're sensitive to some of the people we're thinking about selling energy to and so on. And to my mind, that's just not going to wash. The other thing is, you can mark this down. If there is a debate, it's only... it's a foregone conclusion because of the makeup of the legislature. It was probably a foregone conclusion too, with Voisey's Bay. But the difference between Voisey's Bay, this one, and the Upper Churchill, remember the Upper Churchill, what people should remember, there was a small opposition then like there's a small opposition now. But in the House of Assembly, when there was a debate and a vote, the vote for the Upper Churchill in the House of Assembly was unanimous. Even the opposition members voted for the development. Now, I don't think there's a prospect of that happening this time because of the secrecy and the lack of information and the uncertainty. It didn't happen with Voisey's Bay. It came down to a vote on party lines, basically. The Liberal government voted for it, and one Conservative member voted for it, who's Fabian Manning, who was, after that, for other reasons, booted out of the Tory caucus and got rewarded for his efforts by becoming a senator. So,
let me take
with
time.
a PC government in Canada.
We have like 1.5 minutes left. So first of all, let me take this time to thank you very much for taking your time to get on and take an hour and a half and explain. Certainly in your former role as Premier, as a concerned citizen, with tremendous information, sitting as a cabinet minister. I think you were first elected 1989, and giving this information out in totality to the people to be able to sit down and think about. And I even leave you with this, and you remember the White Rose development when the government, in fact, gave money to opposition groups to go and appear before, some group actually, to talk about whether or not they were using an FPSO or a GBS.
Sure enough. Yep.
And this is something where people are involved and there's real people input. But I do want to thank you so much for your time. I think this was a tremendous hour and a half. And you know, we really hope that people continue to question, to talk, never be afraid to question what a government is doing. We've learned that in the past, and continue that into our future. And thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure, Sue. Listen, I'm pro-development. I'd like for someone to find a way to do the Lower Churchill, do it right, do it as a benefit for us. Just right now, it just doesn't seem right, and it doesn't feel right to me.
I think it's been a great time on this, and you know, maybe, and I'll try to impose on you again, maybe within another 3 or 4 weeks or so, and maybe you know, we can get on, and if there's further information come out, go over it a bit more. But I don't think we can talk about it enough. And when we're talking about, you know, the Lower Churchill, when we're talking about renewable resource, when we're talking about the people's money, we cannot talk about it enough.
I couldn't agree with you more. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Roger. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.